Imagine a silence so deep it feels heavy, a white, blinding expanse where the only sound is the wind screaming through jagged peaks of rock and ice. The temperature is 30 degrees below zero. The air is so thin every breath feels like drowning. There is no food. There is no water. There is no life. This is the Andes mountain range, a place where humans are not meant to exist. But on October 13th, 1972, 45 people fell from the sky into this frozen hell. They were rugby players, students, friends, and family. They were dressed for a vacation on the beach, wearing summer shirts and light jackets. They were supposed to die on impact. Most of them did. But for the survivors, the crash was the easy part. What followed was 72 days of the most brutal, terrifying, and inspiring battle for life in human history. This is not just a story of survival. It is a story of what happens when the human spirit refuses to break, even when the world has already dug its grave. It began with laughter. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 was a chartered flight carrying the Old Christians Club rugby team from Montevideo to Santiago, Chile. These were young men, strong, athletic, wealthy, and full of life. They were bringing their mothers and sisters along for a weekend of shopping and matches. The mood on board was electric. They were throwing rugby balls down the aisle, playing cards, joking with the pilots. They felt invincible. They had no idea that they were flying toward an invisible guillotine. The Andes are a treacherous beast. On the afternoon of Friday the 13th, the pilots made a fatal error. Blinded by heavy clouds and miscalculating their speed, they began their descent too early. They thought they were over the green valleys of Chile. In reality, they were descending straight into the heart of the jagged peaks. The turbulence hit first. The plane dropped hundreds of feet in seconds. The laughter died instantly. Then the clouds parted. Directly in front of them wasn't the runway. It was a black wall of rock. The pilot slammed the throttle forward, trying to pull the nose up. The engines screamed, fighting gravity. But it was too late. The right wing struck the mountain first, shearing off instantly and taking the tail section with it. 5 people were sucked out into the void, still strapped to their seats. Seconds later, the left wing tore away. The fuselage, the body of the plane, became a high-speed toboggan, sliding down a steep glacier at 200 miles per hour. It smashed into a snowbank, compressing the nose and crushing the cockpit. Then, there was silence. Out of 45 passengers, 12 were dead instantly. Others were critically injured, with broken legs and metal shrapnel embedded in their bodies. They were stranded at 11,700 feet. Among the wreckage was Nando Parado. He lay in a coma, his skull fractured, thought to be dead by his friends. He would wake up 3 days later to a nightmare. His mother was dead, his sister was dying, and the world had already given up on looking for them. The first night was a test of torture. The temperature plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The survivors had no winter clothes. They huddled together in the smashed fuselage, creating a human pile to share body warmth. If you fell asleep on the outside of the pile, you froze. If you moved away, you died. But they had hope. They were modern men in a modern world. "They will find us," they told each other. "We just have to wait." They were wrong. The plane was white. The snow was white. From the air, the wreckage was invisible. Days turned into a week. Their supplies were pathetic. A few chocolate bars, some jam, and a couple of bottles of wine found in the luggage. They rationed it strictly, 1 square of chocolate and a capful of wine per day. But hunger is a relentless enemy. It doesn't just hurt, it changes you. By the 10th day, the food was gone. The body began to consume itself. Their muscles wasted away.
Their minds began to drift toward madness. They tried everything to survive. They melted snow on sheets of metal to get water, but the metal burned their lips with cold. They used seat cushions as snowshoes.
They fashioned sunglasses out of the pilots' sun visors to prevent snow blindness. Their ingenuity was incredible, but it couldn't solve the biggest problem: starvation. On the 11th day, they found a small transistor radio in the luggage. They managed to rig an antenna to pick up a signal. They crowded around the tiny speaker, desperate for news of their rescue. What they heard broke them. The news announcer's voice crackled through the static, stating clearly that the search for the missing Uruguayan flight had been called off. All passengers were presumed dead. The search would only resume in the spring to recover the bodies. Called off. Abandoned. Nando Parado looked at his friend Gustavo. "We are dead men," he whispered. The realization was heavy, suffocating. But Gustavo looked back and said, "No, we are not dead. It just means we have to get out of here on our own." But to walk out, they needed energy, and there was no food. Around them lay the bodies of their friends and family, preserved perfectly in the ice. It was a taboo, a nightmare, a line that civilized humans do not cross. But as the days passed, the hunger became a physical violence. It was no longer a question of morality, it was a question of biology. They made a pact, a sacred agreement between friends. If any of them died, the others had permission to use their body for sustenance. It was an act of love, a communion of survival. They did what they had to do. They chose life. But the mountain wasn't done with them. On the night of October 29th, while they slept, a deep rumble shook the glacier. An avalanche slammed into the fuselage, burying them alive in seconds. Snow filled the cabin, pressing against their faces, suffocating them. For 3 days, they were trapped inside the buried plane, buried beneath feet of snow, with the bodies of 8 more friends who had died in the slide. The air ran out. They had to poke a metal pole through the roof just to breathe. It was a tomb. When they finally dug their way out, the realization hit them. They were not just fighting hunger or cold. They were fighting the mountain itself. And the mountain was winning. Weeks turned into months. November came and went. December arrived. They were rotting alive. Their skin was burned black by the UV rays. Their lips were cracked and bleeding. They were skeletons wrapped in rags. They knew they couldn't wait for summer. They had to cross the mountains. 3 men were chosen for the expedition: Nando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Vizintin. Canessa was a medical student, stubborn and strong. Parado was driven by a singular purpose: to see his father again, to tell him he was alive. They spent weeks preparing. They stitched together a sleeping bag using the insulation from the plane's tail. This was crucial. Without it, they would freeze to death on the open peaks at night. On December 12th, 2 months after the crash, they began the climb. Look at the map of the Andes. To the west lay Chile and Salvation. To the east, Argentina. The survivors believed they were near the edge of the mountains. The pilots had said they were close to Curicó. They were wrong. They were in the middle of the chain. Parado and Canessa climbed for 3 days straight, scaling a vertical wall of ice. They had no climbing gear, no ropes, no pitons, just rugby shoes and desperation. Every step was a battle against gravity. On the morning of the 3rd day, Nando reached the summit of the peak. He expected to see the green valleys of Chile below. He expected to see farmhouses, roads, life. He pulled himself over the ridge and looked out. His heart stopped. In every direction, as far as the eye could see, there were only more mountains. Endless, jagged, white peaks. No green valleys, no rescue, just an ocean of ice. Roberto Canessa climbed up beside him. He saw the view and collapsed. "We are dead," he said. "This is impossible." Nando looked at him. He looked at the endless death in front of him, and then he looked back at the crash site, a tiny speck miles below where his friends were dying. "We may be walking to our deaths," Nando said,
"But I would rather die walking than let that mountain kill me."
They sent Vizintin back to the crash site to save food. Nando and Roberto would continue alone, a suicide mission into the unknown. For 10 days they walked. They walked until their feet bled. They walked until they were hallucinating. They slept in holes dug in the snow, huddling inside their makeshift sleeping bag while the wind howled outside like a demon. The landscape was alien. Massive glaciers, crevasses that dropped into bottomless darkness. One slip meant death. Nando took the lead. He told Roberto, "Just one more step, just to that rock, just to that ridge." Slowly, the landscape began to change. The snow began to soften. The air grew slightly warmer. On the 9th day of the trek, Nando stopped. He pointed a shaking finger toward the ground. There, growing by a rock, was a tiny patch of moss, green, the color of life. They stumbled forward. The snow gave way to rocks, then dirt, then grass. They saw a cow. They saw a river. And then, on the other side of the roaring river, they saw something they hadn't seen in 72 days. A man. The man was a Chilean cowboy named Sergio Catalan. The roar of the river was too loud to speak, so he threw a rock wrapped in paper and a pencil across the water. Nando, with shaking hands, wrote a note that would become legendary. "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have a friend up there who is injured. In the plane, there are still 14 injured people. We have no food. We are weak. When are you coming to get us? Please, we cannot walk anymore." He threw the rock back. The cowboy read it.
He signaled that he understood, and he rode his horse for 10 hours to reach the nearest police station.
The next day, the sound of helicopter blades shattered the silence of the Andes. Nando Parado guided the rescue team back to the crash site. When the helicopters crested the ridge, the survivors at the fuselage heard the sound. They dragged themselves out of the broken plane, waving their arms, crying, falling to their knees in the snow. They had been lost for 72 days. They had survived an air crash, sub-zero temperatures, starvation, an avalanche, and despair. Of the 45 who boarded the plane, only 16 came home. The story of the Andes survivors is often called a miracle, but to call it a miracle is to take credit away from the men who lived it. It wasn't a miracle that saved them. It was discipline. It was love for one another.
It was the refusal to accept the inevitable.
When Nando Parado stood on that mountain peak and saw only more mountains, the logical choice was to lie down and die. But he chose the illogical. He chose to take one more step. We all face our own Andes. We all face moments where the world seems cold, empty, and impossible. When you find yourself in that crash, when the avalanche hits, remember the boys on the mountain. Remember that as long as you can take one breath and then one more, you are not dead. And as long as you are not dead, there is a way home. If this story inspired you, please like this video. It helps these stories reach more people. And subscribe to the channel for more true tales of extreme survival. I'll see you in the next one.